Our scripture reading this evening is taken from Luke chapter 9, verses 28 to 36, from the New Revised Standard Version. The Transfiguration. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James, and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance on his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory, and the two men stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things that they had seen. Here endeth our reading for this evening. Thanks be to God.
And I would like to just read this quote from Professor Robert Alter's recent translation of the whole Bible from the Hebrew. He says, "The unacknowledged heresy among most modern English versions of the Bible is the use of translation as a vehicle for explaining the Bible instead of representing it in another language. And in the most egregious instances, this amounts to explaining away the Bible." I'm not going to read the rest of the quote. According to me, the New Revised Standard Version is one of the best translations, and probably academically the translation to which we usually refer. Unfortunately, I would like to argue that maybe in terms of the Transfiguration in Luke chapter 9, the New Revised Standard Version misses the point a bit. And it starts in verse 30, where it says, "Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him." Maybe the English Standard Version and the Revised Standard Version's translations are better there, where it says, "And behold, two men were talking to him, Moses and Elijah." And then verse 32 says the following, "Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake," according to the New Revised Standard Version, "they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him." The translation of the English Standard Version says, "Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep. But when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him." And the latest, the Brill Dictionary of Ancient Greek, that word that is translated with stayed awake, or translated with became fully awake, should be having awakened. I think it is quite important for this passage. I see this passage as one of the most difficult passages in the Bible, or that has been my perception the last 3 weeks, that I've been trying to figure it out. And yes, I went through the Greek, I translated the Greek. I'm not going to even try to put my own translation in front of you. I'm scared of that. But the reason that I find that this is one of the most difficult passages in the Bible is mainly due to the fact that it is already an interpretation of a story told by Mark. We know that Mark wrote the story, and Luke and Matthew sometimes took Mark as one of their sources, and they brought their own story to it. In the case of the Transfiguration, I think that Luke had a field day in rewriting the story. He makes some seemingly haphazard changes that makes you want to shout out, "Why?" Just to mention a few. He changes the time that the Transfiguration took. It is said to have taken place from 6 days, or in 6 days after the event. He changes it to 8 days. And today still commentators are debating why. We just don't know really. He omits the word high from high mountain when Jesus goes up the mountain in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Mark. It's a high mountain. But in Luke, for some or other mind-boggling reason, it's just a mountain. He tells us of all these wonderful things that happened on the mountain. Jesus' face shined with glory and his clothes changed flashing white, according to Luke. But according to Mark and Matthew that follows him, he was transformed or transfigured altogether. As in Mark, Moses and Elijah appears and they talk to Jesus. Luke makes his readers privileged to what they are talking about. They are talking about his exodus or his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. And again here, depending on which commentary you read, some would say, and I tend to like the idea that we should have left the word exodus as exodus, and not translated with departure. It seems that while Peter, John, and James is reported to be awake in Luke's report, reported to be awake in Mark and in Matthew, in Luke's report, they are asleep. And this is why I think that maybe the New Revised Standard Version might be translating this wrongly. But the possibility is also a possibility, so maybe I'm wrong. It's one of those passages that can become quite tricky. The disciples are asleep, awaking just in time to see Moses and Elijah off. And maybe this is Luke's way to try to make something of these words of Peter, suggesting that they must build tents for Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. Maybe, and I was wondering if it could not be the fact that they were expected as disciples to feed 5,000 men and their women and their children just shortly before this. Maybe that could have been Peter's way of just saying, well, let's get ahead and make sure it's something that we can do. I'm not sure, but that would make sense to me. Maybe I'm just guessing. Luke also seems to remove the Aramaic loan words that he encounters. He changes Peter's calling Jesus as rabbi to the Greek word for master. And it's not the word that you would usually use. It is someone that is there. There is this rift that you would think is really a master. He even changes the words coming out of the cloud from "this is my beloved son" to "this is my chosen son." The other reason why I find this story so difficult is because in the different ways it is interpreted. If you read one commentary, you might be quite confident in the meaning of what you see. When you read a second, you might say, wait a minute. When you get to the third and the fourth and the fifth and the sixth, you are almost in a sea of different opinions and you're not 100% sure. So this brings me to the point where I would like to say that this is very much like a pointillistic painting. I don't know if you know the paintings of George Seurat and Paul Signat in the 18th century, late 18th century, where they used points and different hues. Later on, Peter Mondrian, if I remember his name correct, changed it into completely going back to just the different colors, the primary colors, and he came up with his distale. But coming back to Seurat and Signat, what they did is, in the time when cameras were the thing that started to get in and where you had to get the impression, they said, but what is a picture? What does it contain? And they said, points. And so they would use points, different colors, hues of something, and they would create a picture. And if you stand close to it, you just see a lot of dots. It's only when you stand back that you see the bigger picture. So I'm talking this evening about my impressions of the Transfiguration. I do believe that we can use the Transfiguration as a metaphor of worship, of transforming of worship, because I think what we find in Luke is a transformation or movement away from where we expect transformations to take place and transfigurations to take place. I'm not so sure how far religion is changed through this transfiguration, but I am quite sure that the transfiguration should bring us to a point where our world and the way we perceive our world is changed. So, the story of the Transfiguration in the Gospel of Luke leaves the following impression on me. It consists out of a lot of blunt and hidden references to the Old Testament and other significant Jewish apocalyptic writings and works such as 1 Enoch. It only becomes a picture when we stand back. In his version of the story, Luke adds some dots and colors to an already dotted picture. My first impression is that Luke takes the story of the Transfiguration, and though he tells this wonderful tale, he downplays the things that makes it wonderful. If 6 days in Mark means something like on the eve of the fullness of time, the 7th day being the fullness of time, that's my guess, then maybe moving it on to the 8th day says that what happens after the pawpaw hit the fan. The special time has passed. If a high mountain in the ancient world is the place where you knew you would encounter the divine, then Luke says that encountering God is a much more down-to-earth business. You don't have to climb high mountains, and I'm thinking of The Sound of Music, climb every mountain. You don't have to do that to find him. Luke might say, well, you need to pray. Maybe Luke is also saying, keep awake. All the wonderful things of life, the moments when you meet God, will pass you by. Within the context of the greater gospel, I think that Luke is also painting a word picture here about who Jesus of Nazareth, the charismatic itinerant preacher, is. He downplays Jesus' transformation on the mountain. According to Mark, Jesus is metamorphized. Sorry for using that word, and maybe it means something different, but Jesus is changed wholly on the mountain. Luke says that his face became different, or it changed, and his clothes became light flashing white. And some of the manuscript says his clothes became as white as snow. Well, this reminds us of Moses after he had received the tablets of the commandments the second time in Exodus chapter 34, where his face had changed. According to the Septuagint, he also shone with glory. I think Luke simply wants to tell us Jesus actually belongs to the heavenly world. We find in 1 Enoch 17:1 verse 1, which is a typical apocalyptic story, in other words, a story using images to tell us something about the realities that we live in today. We find in that story that he writes this report: after that, my spirit was taken away and it ascended to heaven, and I saw the angels. And it's interesting how he describes the angels. And he says, and their garments were white, as were their tunics, and the light of their faces was like snow. Jesus' change of face and garments confirms where he belongs. It also does a second thing. It brings heaven down to earth. The way he acts, not being afraid, also tells us something about who Jesus is. And I don't think it is a case of who Jesus was, it's a case of who Jesus is, because the disciples are sleeping at that point in time. In Exodus chapter 34, the Israelites were so afraid of the glory shining from Moses' face that he had to cover it when he talked to them. Moses and Elijah are inhabitants of heaven. Both their deaths are surrounded with mystery. And yet Jesus interacts with them. He is not afraid, like the shepherds in Luke 2, the first time that the glory, there's two places in the Gospel of Luke where the glory of God is shown or is found in the world. The one place is in in Luke chapter 2, and the other place is here in Luke chapter 9. So he's not afraid like the shepherds in Luke chapter 2, or the disciples in the story when they encountered the divine. The appearance of the cloud confirms that not only the representatives of the law and prophets are present, but God himself. We know that God made his presence known to the Israelites in the desert through a cloud, tracking with them. Even the Jewish writer Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, says the cloud signifies the appearance of God. So not only is Jesus put on equal footing with Moses and Elijah, after they've left, God himself turns up. Contrary to the Israelites being excluded from God's presence, where only Moses is allowed in Exodus chapter 34 to enter, it seems that the disciples are enveloped in the cloud. At least Luke hints at it. It is in the cloud that the words ring, "This is my chosen son," or "This is my son, the chosen one. Listen to him." Not Moses or Elijah, not any permanent glazing heavenly beings are depicted to be in the relationship Jesus is in towards God, his chosen son. And I think this is very significant. Like I've said, I think Luke is talking to us and telling the readers, not the disciples, something about how the world is being transformed. I think Luke's word picture not only paints the itinerant preacher of Nazareth as the one who is in a special relationship with God. For a second time in the gospel, we are faced with the fact that earthly beings meet heavenly beings, just as in Luke chapter 2. The real transformation in the Transfiguration, the real transformation is the transfiguration into how the ordinary, the world around us, changes into the extraordinary when Jesus is present. Luke paints a picture of inclusivity, not a picture of exclusivity. It's not like with the Israelites being far off and only Moses that can enter the cloud. But this picture of inclusivity says that, and this is my interpretation, I think, if 3 fishermen from Galilee can enter a cloud and experience God's presence, so why can't you and I? I think that's also why it's not a high mountain. God really, in this story, transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. The irony, and this is also one of Luke's brush strokes, is that the disciples doesn't really know that Jesus carries heaven here on earth with him, to them. They're part of God's orchestra, but they're not knowing that they're actually playing in it. The theme pops up again in Luke 24, verse 13 to 35, on the road to Emmaus, where 2 disciples is traveling away from the events of Jesus' crucifixion, just to discover that Jesus is with them. For Peter and the others, Jesus is said to be the triumphant Messiah of God. That's what he confessed in Luke chapter 9, verse 20, just before this story. And Peter had confessed this with confidence. And yes, Jesus' exodus, his journey starts not with freedom from political oppression. This might be what the disciples have in sight, but I don't think this is what Luke is saying to them. He's saying to them that heaven is not a utopian hedonistic vision where all is good and right. Meeting God is journeying with him in the face of uncertainty and in the face of pain, in the face of death. Meeting God doesn't have to happen on the highest of mountains. Encountering God is a down-to-earth business. And this brings us to transformation and transfiguration. We don't have to change ourselves so much as we thought we had to. Luke says that if you live life to its fullest, well, my interpretation of Luke at least, is that it is not an alien process. It happens here, and it happens when you go out from here. It happens when you open your eyes and you shrug off the sleep and see the divine in your reality. When you take a moment to stand back and to realize that the steps of your life are just dots on a bigger picture with God. The Transfiguration story recalibrates us to face life and to keep on course. So, how does it change our worship? I think everything that we do is a way in worshiping God. And maybe that might just change the way that you relate to other people. How does it change our religion? I think we don't become wall builders, but bridge builders. I find it interesting that Professor Larry Hurtado wrote quite recently a book about Christianity, which he called Destroyer of Gods. It breaks down those gods that we build up and that's better to worship. But it puts us in a situation where we can celebrate life, even in the face of death. So if we look at Jesus' transfiguration story in the Gospel of Luke, maybe it's time once again to become just ourselves and be down to earth. Amen.